want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Enemies List. I'm your host, Rick Wilson. Thank you so much for joining us once again, and I am tremendously excited about this conversation today. We are joined today by Anne Applebaum, who is one of the foremost writers and thinkers in the world today about the subject of autocracy and freedom. And she has a brilliant new book out called Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. And it's a cheerful, lightweight summer beach read, obviously. But Anne, first off, welcome to the show. And you again have been one of the people who have led, I think, a lot of the intellectual fight in this country over trying to get people to understand there is a rising tide of authoritarian darkness in the world, and we've got to face it. We've got to look it square in the eye. We've got to understand what it is. Tell us how you came to write this book. It's the question I ask everybody is, how did you come to write this particular book at this moment in time?
It's funny, I came to write the book because of a particular conversation with one person. This is a Venezuelan dissident and the former mayor of Caracas, Leopoldo Lopez, with whom I was talking one time and who described to me, we were talking about the Venezuelan regime and how weak it is. It's very unpopular. It's a disaster.
Sure.
It's impoverished people. There are more Venezuelan refugees than there are Ukrainian refugees. And Leopoldo explained to me, I said, well, so how do they stay in power? The Venezuelan opposition, I should say, does lots of things right. They can get 1 million people on the street. They're well organized. It's lots of intelligent people on that side. Why don't they win? He said, well, look, the Russians give the Venezuelans military weapons. The Chinese give them surveillance technology and invest in their and give kickbacks to the regime. The Cubans bring in secret policemen and tell them different ways to monitor the circuit. The Iranians, Iran, a country that has absolutely no links to Venezuela ever before in history. Somehow they're close friends, basically because they both face sanctions and they both oppose the United States. And so the Iranians help the Venezuelans evade sanctions. In exchange, the Venezuelans give passports to Hezbollah operatives, and on and on. And I suddenly understood the world a little bit differently, that a lot of the regimes that we see, they're not operating in isolation. It's not, we tend to think of Venezuela as a story that belongs to South America. You're interested in Latin America, right. You care about that. Iran is a story that belongs to the Middle East. Russia is a Eurasian story. Actually, they're connected. And because these regimes see it that way, they see themselves as being connected in a network, and they oppose us. They have very little in common in most ways. They don't share an ideology. They have very different economies, but they see a common threat. And the threat is the language of liberal democracy, the language of rights, American foreign policy, Europeans, and so on. And that was once I understood that, I started seeing the world differently.
So, one of the things you point out in this book is that modern day autocracy, the modern day dictators, there's not really the same sort of old school ideological underpinning. It's not necessarily a far right construct. It's not necessarily a communist construct. It's just about the raw retention and exercise of power and the wealth that flows from it. So, I guess Putin in some ways is like the perfect example of this, because he really has no ideology except for power and wealth.
Yeah, that's right. Putin in some ways invented the idea of the modern autocrat, who's someone who has gathered enormous amount of wealth through money laundering, through the abuse of Western financial systems, through theft. And then he uses that wealth to empower himself and people around him. And then he slowly becomes more and more repressive in order to, push back against any demand for transparency or the rule of law. and eventually
Sure.
winds up as a dictator. And that's the modern path to absolute power, not through revolution or coup d'etat or street battles, which might have been the case in the 20th century. It's now through the accumulation of financial power and wealth. And that model is copied and followed by lots of other people in lots of other countries. And sometimes they adopt bits of ideology. I mean, lately, Putin sometimes talks about being a Russian imperialist, and the Chinese still talk about being the Chinese Communist Party and so on. But really, when you look at what they do and how they behave, they really have what they do has very little in common with whatever ideology they claim to have. I mean, okay, Putin is a Russian imperialist and he's destroying his country. He's impoverished people. He's removed Russia from the world economy. He's lowered living standards. So he's not really interested in Russians. He's interested in himself and making himself, keeping himself in power indefinitely.
Right. So with Putin, he had a moment where the end of the Cold War causes the collapse of the Soviet Union, causes the collapse of traditional communism, and the conversion of all these state industries into semi-private or private hands was a moment where he could build a claque of people around him who were all going to get fabulously wealthy off of this deal.
Yep.
You don't really always have that, though. I mean, Iran, I guess, has some of that, given some, petrodollar wealth. But places like Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea don't. I mean, what is it that those countries, they still need a sort of, if not ideological glue, is it the cult of personality glue that holds them together?
I mean, it's cult of personality, mostly it's repression. And even in a poor country, you can keep people on board. And I've been to Venezuela, and actually this is what was explained to me there. You can keep people on board with the regime through very little things. I mean, if everybody's starving and you send food packages to people who agree to vote for Maduro in the next election, then you can keep them loyal. I mean, you can keep people loyal through a combination of payoffs and repression, even in an extremely poor regime. I mean, I don't know North Korea well, and I haven't been there. I'm guessing it's something like that there. And if you're willing to use an enormous amount of violence, which North Koreans are, then you can also simply you can frighten people. One important point is that we now live in an era when many of these dictators are willing to use that kind of violence because they don't care what anybody else says about them. It's kind of age of impunity. They're willing to kill anybody, imprison anybody, and whatever the international community says or the UN says or some human rights organizations say, they're not bothered by it. And that's also a new element in the world.
I mean, in some ways, I look at Trumpism that way. This is the shamelessness is part of the superpower of pitching autocracy in America, where I think there's been a misplaced belief in America that our sophistication as a democracy and our modernity makes us immune to the seduction of autocracy. Talk to us a little bit about where you see that, because I don't think we're immune to it. I feel like we're less and less immune to it.
No, we're less and less immune to it, and the signs of it are all around us. I mean, the decay of certain kinds of institutions, the decay of the judiciary, for example, the lowering of standards, which is something people have just gotten used to. It's kind of okay now for judges to take lots of money from private businessmen who might have interests in how they decide, and and nobody seems able to stop it, and most people aren't all that bothered by it. The role that oligarchs now play in public life. I was very struck at the Republican convention by the Trump's selection of Vance, which happened at about the same time as Elon Musk declared he was going to give $45 million a month to the campaign. I mean, there's clearly, you can buy policies now. And there was another example of that, which was Trump switching his policy on TikTok. If you remember this from a few months ago,
yeah, sure.
You can now, with enough money, you can pay the government and get them to change. Big money has always had a lot of influence on politics, but the transactional nature of Trumpism and the clarity, the way in which nobody's even hiding the fact that Trump is there to make money for his family and to stay, to keep out of jail and stay in power, and that he really doesn't have anybody else's nobody else's interests at heart. It's like Putin. Putin is not doing whatever he does on behalf of the Russian people, and Trump isn't really working on behalf of the Americans, including the Americans who vote for him. And that's obvious. I mean, it's obvious to anybody who looks at them carefully, and that puts him in a similar world. I mean, there's a reason why he prefers talking to dictators, and certainly in his first term, he preferred talking to, whether it was Xi Jinping or whether it was Kim Jong-il or whether it was Putin. Then he'd rather talk to them than talk to Angela Merkel or to the president of France, who were more or less his equals, right?
It's interesting. Vance is the most pro-Putin elected official, I think, in the Senate by maybe Tommy Tuberville, but he was the most serious of the people in the Senate. That you would think that J.D. Vance would understand the world as it is, and that he would understand that authoritarianism in the form of Putinism is not great. But this is a guy who really has bought into this. I mean, it sounds like it's coming out of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This rhetoric and these statements and these speeches that are so completely on message for the Russian government themes about Ukraine, about America in the world, about all these sort of things. What are your thoughts on, like, where does that virus get into the head of a guy like J.D. Vance, who on paper is supposed to be a bright guy, who's supposed to be someone who understands the world?
I mean, in his case, it's hard for me to read him because I don't know him, and he's had such an extraordinary change. He's changed his spots like 100. Yes. 100%. And so it's very hard to know whether this is just opportunism or whether it's something else. I mean, it looks to me like what he's doing is mimicking and echoing Trump, that he tries to sound as much as possible like Trump. And Trump has always been preferred Putin to, as I said, preferred Putin
Absolutely.
to American allies. And it may be that this has been a game all along to suck up to him. I mean, he may also have. I mean, I don't have any, proof of the connections between. Sure. I mean, we know that Musk was supporting Vance. Whether Musk has business interests in Russia himself, I don't know. I mean, there are people who think he does. I can't confirm that. But there seemed to be. There's an amorality about him. I will say whatever it takes. I will do whatever it takes to be to have power. And I think that goes along with, you're willing to tell lies, you're willing to make up stories, whether it's about Russia, or whether it's about Ukraine, or whether it's about anything else. And he seems happy to do that, as far as I can tell.
I mean, Vance has repeatedly gone out in interviews, even though he knows better, and told the lies about, like, the Ukrainian, like, Zelensky's wife is buying a $2 million Bugatti, and the Ukrainians are buying yachts and palaces and all this. And he knows these things are untrue, but he keeps repeating them. And I find it fascinating that, again, it loops back to that sort of shamelessness about they don't care what other people say after a certain point. They don't feel like they're obligated to live in a world where truth matters.
This is really important. You were asking before about the signs of rising autocracy in the United States. That's a big one. I mean, that's very often dictators tell lies, not so much because they think people will believe them. I mean, but because they can. And by telling a lie, you prove that you're more powerful. I can tell a lie and get away with it. I can say anything I want, and you can't do anything to stop me. And that's a way of demonstrating your power. And you can see it. I mean, I once read a brilliant paper about the Syrian dictator, and it described how how the regime tells ridiculous, incredible lies. Syria is a great tourist destination, in the middle of the war, and so on. And people, and the fact that people say it is a way of showing we're in charge. You can't challenge us. You can't bring up some true facts to contradict what we say. And so, yeah, I think it's a way of asserting your authority and asserting your right to lie.
Is there a countervailing strategy in the world right now that you think is effective against these authoritarian movements?
The only things that I've seen be effective, for example, in those countries where which are becoming illiberal, we just had an election in Poland, for example, in October, where there had been a government that was becoming more and more autocratic in the direction of Hungary, and the election was won, and they won for several reasons. One was by changing the conversation to be about real things, as much as possible. That instead of having an argument about identity and having culture wars, just bringing people away from the culture wars and having them talk about, the stuff of real life. I mean, that was part of it. Part of it was finding different ways to connect to people. I mean, in their case, the state media was dominated by the regime. In our case, the social media is dominated by the far right, in some cases the far left. And so finding a different means of communication. And this worked in Poland by, literally the person who's now the prime minister, spent months going round and round the country talking in local venues. And that was just a different method of communication. Sadly, that's not going to work in the United States at the moment. But.
No, it doesn't scale, unfortunately, in the U.S. So, we talked a little bit about who the big autocratic players in the world are right now. And in Russia, China, Iran, those three seem to be the three with, and Russia being in the tail end of this, those three seem to be the big autocratic powers with an economy, and China being the one with a real truly top two global economy. Does the modern version of autocracy, which is less tied into ideology, does it require a functioning economic system to pay off enough people in the elite and the oligarchs? And the sort of kleptocratic system that has to be there to pay people? Do they have to be economically successful? If you break them economically, do you break on autocracy? I guess is the question I'm asking.
Not necessarily. I mean, as I was just saying, I mean, you have the example of literally failed states. Venezuela is a failed state. North Korea is a failed state. People have starved to death in North Korea. And they're able to stay in charge through this phenomenon of combination of surveillance technology on a scale that we never had in the 20th century.
It is unspeakable in those countries.
Surveillance technology, police control, and it's not so much how wealthy the economy is; it's the degree to which the ruling party or leader is able to manipulate and control it. And so, what Putin did years ago was set up the system of, when we talk about oligarchs in Russia, what we mean are people whose money and wealth is dependent on the state. So they're not wealthy because they invented something better or they rose through the ranks. They're wealthy because of their relationship and contacts to the state. And they're therefore dependent on whoever's in power to keep them wealthy. And those kinds of arrangements, kind of oligarchic arrangements, are much more important than the actual quantity of wealth. I mean, a lot of Russians are very poor. We even discovered that when the invasion of Ukraine started, the big large scale invasion in February 2022, many of the Russians who first came into the wealthier parts of Ukraine, the outskirts of Kiev suburbs, were shocked by how rich it was because Ukrainians, whom we think of as being incredibly poor, were so much richer than Russians. And this is just, the regime has impoverished people. And so it's not so much the size of the economy; it's the way the wealth is distributed and controlled. And by the way, and this is something for any business people who think that having Trump win and having him, convert the United States in this direction, thinking that will be good for business, maybe discover painfully how wrong they are, because the goal of a regime like that is to control business and occupy business and make sure that business goes along with politics. And that might suit some people who fit into the plan, but it will not be good for others.
So, we've sort of touched on Ukraine a few times here, and while Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, it certainly looks like Ukraine, as tenuous as it is sometimes, Russia has, and Putin in particular, they have made a massive gamble, I think, in some ways, because Ukraine did not collapse. The little green men from Putin's world never got to Kyiv and effectively, played the Putin game and overthrew the government. They fought back. NATO has helped them tremendously. Is NATO right now like this the bulwark they're counting on if Trump's reelected? I mean, I have a sense it'll be very bad very quickly if Trump is reelected for Ukraine. But
so it's funny.
I'm curious how NATO is going to stick it out if Trump.
Well, I mean, what NATO unfortunately depends on the U.S. is for big communication systems and intelligence and so on. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of back planning going on in the European NATO partners. I mean, there are contingency plans being made. Weapons production has been increased, and we may get to the point where some NATO countries are ready to fight in Ukraine themselves. I don't know, and I'm not saying that from a position of knowledge. I'm just guessing.
Understood.
There's beginning to be people are beginning to do counter planning, and so yes, there's preparation, but people are, I don't know, people are kind of dumbstruck by what's happened in the United States. The specter of Biden beginning to decline and not stopping it and not understanding it. And it's almost like, people are watching a sleepwalker head to the edge of the cliff and everybody's shouting at him to stop. And yet it doesn't stop. I think it's a kind of horror show for people who really care about European security, but not just in Europe, actually, but anybody who cares about the future of democracy and the ability of free nations to resist this autocratic pressure and propaganda, whether it's in Poland or whether it's in South Korea, or whether it's in Taiwan, is looking at what's going on in the United States with a kind of horror. Because the network that I describe in my book, this connection and relationship between different autocracies, to a lot of people, they see it all around them every day. It's not a book subject. It's their reality.
Part of life.
It's just part of life. And to see the United States kind of not understanding it or veering off in a different direction or being unprepared to gird itself to resist is very disturbing. Actually, I had a German member of the Bundestag say to me a few months ago that he woke up one morning and realized that very soon Europe might be facing three enemies, Russia, China, and the United States, and to have the world shift that profoundly is, you can blame them for being behind the curve, and they are behind the curve, but the scale of the change, given the position that the United States has had for so many decades and the role that the United States has wanted to play as the leader of Europe, as the most important political and economic player in Europe, and to have it suddenly end like that is very disorienting for a lot of people.
So these relationships between the different parts of this sort of autocratic constellation that's out there, you talk about it in the book, and you talk about your Venezuela example was terrific. It's there are these flows of what these terrible bad actors do well to help the other bad actors do the things that they don't do as well. Is there a valence here? Is there a weak spot here for the West and for pro-democratic states and people who want to disrupt the autocracy? Is there a valence here? Is it the financial system of the world, or is it where else is it that these folks are vulnerable to disruption?
Well, first of all, they are absolutely vulnerable. Our financial system has enabled a lot of what they do, and beginning to systematically cut them out of it is part of the story. Understanding that any kind of economic relationship with autocracies needs to have a political context, and being a lot more careful about how we invest, if we invest in those countries, and being and understanding the need to the expression people use sometimes is de-risk. Make sure that we're not dependent on them for anything, and make sure that we, whatever raw materials it is we need to run our economy, that we know where to get them, and they're not, China doesn't control all of them. So there are pieces of the story like that. I mean, there are also, these countries do have different interests, and it may be possible to break some of the way. I mean, China and Russia are a very odd couple in a lot of ways, because they compete. They have this long border that has been contested in the past. Russia actually occupies some territory that used to be Chinese. The city of Vladivostok is one of them. there are, China has more interests in maintaining a global economy than Russia does, and has much bigger and more complex relationship with the United States. I mean, there are breaks between them that could also work.
Right.
I also think that thinking about working in tandem more closely with the democratic movements inside those countries, which are sometimes very big and which sometimes understand them better than we do. I mean, you want to ask the question about where the Russians are weak, ask the Russian opposition. Where are the Venezuelans weak, ask the Venezuelan opposition. I mean, I don't think we pay enough attention to them because for example, this story about finance and money laundering and so on, they've been telling it for years. They've been talking about it for a long time. It's only that very recently we've begun to pay attention.
The democratic opposition in these countries ranges from inspirational to ineffective to a threat. Has technology almost outstripped the ability of democratic movements to exist inside these kleptocracies? Because China being the alpha case.
Yeah, it's almost like it's like nuclear war used to be. This kind of constant one-upmanship. People find ways around the technology, and then the regime finds ways to block them, and it goes back and forth. And some places people have been pretty successful, either through using VPNs or alternative forms of communication.
Sure.
In talking to each other. I mean, I've heard of Bitcoin being used as a way of funding opposition movements in places where nobody has access to the banking system or where the banking system is monitored. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into this, and there's more of it than you know. I mean, it's more creative even than you think it is. But you're right that the Chinese model, which is total surveillance of everything, a combination of street cameras plus maybe even DNA testing plus monitoring people on the internet, means that increasingly, plus AI, of course, and using which helps you understand pools of big data, more and more is seeking to have not just control of people or not just to be able to monitor people, but to be able to predict political objections before they happen. So to be able to map out where political opposition might emerge from. And I don't think anybody is as advanced as the Chinese is that. I'm not even sure anybody else could do it to the degree that they can do it, even if they wanted to. But it's beginning to think about how technologically to counter that I think it's a huge task for us. I mean, as I said, the opposition do it, but it goes back and forth.
Yeah, I think that I worry a lot about the persuasive nature of AI. And when in America we're having these massive battles about how much should it be able to interact with people at a certain level, I worry that autocracy and AI is a very bad recipe for the future.
It is
not only in what you just said, like the prediction of behavior, but the manipulation of behavior.
They will seek to manipulate behavior, but people are seeking to do that in the United States right now.
Of course.
The aftermath of the attempted Trump assassination, there was just this plethora of AI altered images and constant new narratives and changing narratives designed to make people feel this or this thing or that the other thing. So our own internet is a huge testing ground for narrative manipulation. And foreign countries play around in that too, and they watch it very carefully and they take lessons from it. So you don't have to be Chinese in order to think about malign manipulation. But you're certainly right that with malign actors with access to AI are going to become a lot more powerful unless we're willing to stand up to it, and unless we're conscious of it, we understand it, and we know it's coming. I mean, some people know it's coming, but my fear is that we could have a U.S. government that not only doesn't want to block that, but wants to participate in it, and we could be closer to that than we think.
I think that's right. I mean, look, I think we are at the hinge of history here in this country right now. What's your prediction for a Trump administration manned with people like who are clearly at the minimum, shall we say, authoritarian curious? The J.D. Vances of the world, the Steve Bannons, the Steve Millers, all those people. What do you think? What do you think a Trump administration looks like in terms of the global battle for freedom?
So the worst version of the Trump administration would not only dismantle institutions at home, it would undermine existing whatever is left of institutions around the world. It could destroy NATO. NATO is easily destroyed, by the way. You don't have to leave the treaty. All the president would have to do is say, "I'm not going to fight for anybody in NATO. Goodbye," and then it's over.
Right.
I mean, that's
Article 5. I'm
Article
done with
5.
Article 5. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a deterrent. So, NATO works because people believe it's going to work, because it's a deterrent. And there could be war in Europe very quickly soon after that. There could be war in East Asia very quickly after that. I mean, you can see how fast the breakdown would happen. You could see a Venezuelan regime becoming aggressive. You could see a South African government becoming aggressive. I mean, as soon as there's no, as soon as the United States plays no role at all, and there's no democratic bloc, which has an interest in keeping any rules, then you could see all of them breaking very fast. I mean, it could be like a dam breaking.
Yeah, so we could end up in a world that looks very, very different the minute Donald Trump says, we're going to stop intelligence sharing with Ukraine, we're going to stop intelligence sharing with NATO, we're going to abandon Article 5, and that's because we're putting America first. That's a terrible signal around the world.
So if you did that in Europe, the immediate reaction would be the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Taiwanese would all immediately understand that America was abandoning them, to the Australians. I mean, and you would see in both Europe and Asia in particular, you would see several different things. You would see some hedging. People would say, okay, we better be friends with China now. Or we better be friends with Russia now. We thought we had a deal with the United States. That's not going to work out. So you'd see a certain amount of switching sides, which would have economic implications as well as political implications. And then in other cases, you might see the regional autocracies saying, "Oh, okay, free reign for us." And you could see, and that could, again, both could have military, economic, political impact. I mean, it's something that could happen very fast.
I spoke to a German friend not long ago, and she goes, we could build nuclear weapons if we had to. And I said,
and they will.
And I said, yeah, I know you're perfectly technically capable of doing anything. She's like, it's the most radical idea in a way for the Germans to think of doing that. But without you, our world is a very bleak place, 350 miles to the east. And, I wonder if, given Putin's extraordinary, profligate burning through of Russian men and machines, he has the ability to push into Europe, but I think he has the ability to disrupt it, certainly.
Well, he's attempting now. I mean, this is something I'm going to have to try and write about later in the summer. I mean, there's already, that there's this weird spate of arson all over Europe.
Oh, yes.
Weird fires. There's already a kind of weird hybrid war on the Polish border. The Belarusians are importing migrants from the Middle East and trying to shove them across the border to threaten. I mean, so there's already all kinds of weird games being played. The Russians are playing in Europe now, murdering people in broad daylight. So far, mostly Russians, but who knows in the future. And the feeling there, of the Russians being close and of playing games with us and with our politics is much stronger actually than it is in the United States. So it might not be initially some kind of big invasion, because you're right. I mean, they've destroyed their army, and they've destroyed huge quantity of their equipment in this completely pointless war in Ukraine. But there could be other ways in which they try to undermine or weaken or change. I mean, their big political goal for many, many years has been to break up the European Union and to break up NATO. That's been their goal, because, even if they can weaken those institutions, then they can at least deal one-on-one with those countries, and they can bring over one or the other onto their side and so on.
Fight them in serial, not parallel. And yeah. Well,
I mean, you could well have in Germany, you could have a movement of people who say, why aren't we aligned with Russia? Americans have abandoned us, and that would be a big economic and political change in Europe, and for us too.
It is quite remarkable to me that we now have many Americans who are saying, why aren't we more aligned with Russia?
It's extraordinary.
It really is. It's disturbing and extraordinary. Well, Anne Applebaum, I want to thank you so very much for your time today. I deeply appreciate it. Folks, the book is Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. I highly recommend it. Anne is a brilliant writer. Have a look, and we will see you next time on the Enemies List.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anne.